Imagine the summer of the year 1099. The city of Jerusalem, holy to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, stands surrounded by a ragged but determined army. These men have walked thousands of miles, across mountains, deserts, and rivers, leaving trails of hunger, death, and disease behind them. They are the crusaders, warriors who answered the Pope's call to liberate the Holy Land. Their bodies are exhausted, their armor battered, but their eyes burn with fanatical conviction. For them, Jerusalem is not just another city. It is the final prize, the ultimate goal, the very gateway to heaven itself. Inside the city walls, fear spreads like wildfire. The defenders are a mixed force of Fatimid Egyptian soldiers, local Muslims, and a Jewish community that has lived in the city for centuries. From the towers, they look down at the Crusader camp with dread. Supplies are low, water is scarce, and the rumors of what the Crusaders did in Antioch and Marat still echo in every whispered conversation. People know that surrender is unlikely. The city of God must be defended, even if it means death. The Crusaders themselves are desperate. They arrived in early June, after years of campaigning, nearly starving. Many of their horses have died. Some men have only scraps of cloth for clothing. Yet what they lack in strength, they make up for in religious zeal. Chroniclers wrote that priests led daily processions around the camp, carrying relics and chanting psalms, urging the men to keep faith. One chronicler described the moment as if the Crusaders were standing at the edge of the world, preparing to step directly into God's presence. By July, the siege engines began to appear. Lumber was scarce in the arid hills around Jerusalem, but the Crusaders dismantled ships from Jaffa, stripped local villages, and even tore down rooftops to build towers, rams, and ladders. Every hammer strike echoed with the promise of divine victory. Inside the walls, defenders scrambled to pour boiling oil, sharpen stones, and prepare flaming arrows. Every night, the city echoed with the cries of both sides, prayers from the mosques and chants from the Crusader camp. The psychological weight of this moment cannot be overstated. For the Crusaders, this was the end of a holy journey that had begun 4 years earlier when Pope Urban II declared that anyone who took up the cross would be forgiven of all sins. Many of these men had left families and lands behind, believing they might never return. Their motivation was not only glory or wealth but eternal salvation. Jerusalem was seen as the earthly reflection of heaven. To take it was to step directly into God's light. To fail was to risk damnation. The defenders, on the other hand, saw the Crusaders not as pilgrims but as invaders, men who had already committed atrocities on their march through Anatolia and Syria. For them, the Crusaders represented a brutal foreign army, willing to destroy entire communities in the name of their God. As food and water inside the walls began to run out, many families prayed for a miracle. Some hoped for reinforcements from Egypt. Others believed that Allah would protect the holy city. But with every passing day, the pressure mounted. On July 8th, an extraordinary event shook the Crusader camp. Barefoot and dressed in rags, thousands of men, women, and children marched around the walls of Jerusalem in a solemn procession. Priests carried crosses and holy relics. They sang hymns, wept openly, and begged for God's mercy. Chroniclers compared this to the biblical march around Jericho, where the walls fell at the sound of trumpets. From the battlements, defenders mocked the scene, but inside the camp, the ritual filled the Crusaders with new fire. They believed that God himself would deliver Jerusalem into their hands. Every detail of the siege reflected the collision of two worlds. On the outside, Crusaders starved but held on to faith. On the inside, citizens faced hunger and terror but clung to their own prayers. At night, the city glowed with thousands of lamps, while the Crusader camp flickered with campfires. Both sides knew the final clash was inevitable. It was not a question of if the city would be attacked, but when. By mid-July, the tension was unbearable. Siege towers rolled into place. Rams were prepared. Archers lined up with bows strung tight. The defenders braced themselves for the storm, stacking rocks and boiling water on the walls. In the streets of Jerusalem, mothers clutched their children. In the Crusader camp, knights prayed to the Virgin Mary, sharpening their swords. Everyone, inside and outside the walls, knew that the next assault would decide not only the fate of a city but perhaps the fate of the world. This was not just a military siege. It was an apocalyptic moment, wrapped in the language of salvation and damnation. And as the first siege towers began to creak toward the walls, the air was thick with one truth. Something terrible, something unforgettable, was about to begin. The morning of July 14th, 1099, was unlike any other. The air above Jerusalem shimmered with heat, but it was not the summer sun alone that burned. It was the fire of war about to be unleashed. For weeks, the Crusaders had labored with desperate determination, building siege towers from scraps of wood and broken ships. Now those towers stood ready, taller than the city walls themselves, massive wooden beasts creaking as they were rolled forward. Inside, crossbowmen and archers prepared their weapons. Outside, priests blessed the attackers with relics and crosses, promising that heaven itself would open to them if they fell in the coming assault. From the walls of Jerusalem, the defenders looked down with a mix of dread and fury. Egyptian soldiers poured boiling water into cauldrons, prepared bundles of stones, and ready jars of flaming pitch. Archers lined the battlements, arrows nocked and quivers heavy. Women and children carried buckets of water and sand, ready to extinguish fires. They knew that this was the decisive moment. If the walls held, the city might survive. If they fell, Jerusalem would be at the mercy of the invaders. The first clash came with a thunderous crash. Crusader rams hammered against the gates, their iron tips smashing wood and iron. The defenders responded with a rain of stones and arrows, killing men in waves. Siege towers inched closer, each step met with fire. Defenders hurled flaming torches tied to cloth soaked in oil. For a moment, the Crusaders' machines seemed doomed to burn. But then, in a sudden reversal, a strong wind blew the flames back toward the city walls. Chroniclers described this as divine intervention. Proof, they said, that God fought alongside the Crusaders. The largest tower, under the command of Godfrey of Bouillon, rolled toward the northern wall. Its wooden frame groaned under the strain, shields of dampened hides covering its surface to resist fire. Archers inside fired downward, keeping the defenders at bay. Step by step, the tower closed in, until its drawbridge slammed down onto the wall itself. The Crusaders surged forward, swords flashing in the blinding sun. Inside the city, chaos erupted. Bells rang wildly as the defenders tried to rally. Egyptian soldiers rushed to the breach, striking back with swords and spears. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it almost impossible to see. Women screamed, children cried, and men shouted in a dozen languages, each trying to be heard over the roar of battle. The clash of iron on iron, the cries of the wounded, and the crackle of fire created a terrifying symphony. Meanwhile, on the western side of the city, another tower commanded by Count Raymond of Toulouse pressed forward. The defenders split their forces to stop both threats, but exhaustion weighed heavily. After weeks of siege, their numbers were thin, and their morale weaker still. The Crusaders, by contrast, fought with the desperate energy of men who believed they stood at the threshold of eternity. To die here was to gain heaven. To win here was to seize the earthly Jerusalem, a mirror of the heavenly one they had been promised. By midday, breaches opened wider. Crusaders poured through gaps in the walls, scaling ladders, hacking through gates. Chroniclers claimed that once a handful of knights set foot on the walls, others followed in a relentless tide. Panic spread among the defenders. Some fled deeper into the city, others fought to the last. In the narrow streets, civilians scrambled to find shelter, while soldiers shouted for order. But order was gone. The walls of Jerusalem, which had stood for centuries against countless armies, had been broken. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on the Crusaders. To them, this was not simply the capture of a city. This was divine proof, a holy victory delivered by God himself. Chroniclers described men kneeling in the midst of chaos, raising their hands to heaven, thanking Christ for the miracle. One wrote that the city of the Lord was taken on the very day he willed it. For the defenders, however, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would stain the memory of Jerusalem for centuries. As the gates fell and the towers toppled onto the walls, the crusaders flooded in from every side. The holy city, so fiercely defended, was now breached. Trumpets sounded through the crusader camp, signaling victory, while inside Jerusalem, the sound was one of despair. Families huddled in corners, praying. Merchants abandoned their shops. Priests carried sacred scrolls and relics, hoping to save them from destruction. The final storm of Jerusalem had begun, and nothing could stop it. The Crusaders, filled with the belief that they were God's chosen warriors, surged deeper into the city. Behind them, the walls still smoked. Ahead of them lay narrow streets, holy sanctuaries, and tens of thousands of terrified souls. The city had been breached. But the real horror of Jerusalem in 1099 was only just beginning. The walls of Jerusalem had fallen. For the Crusaders, this was not merely a military victory. It was the fulfillment of a divine mission. Trumpets sounded across the city, banners of the cross were raised, and shouts of triumph echoed through the narrow streets. But almost immediately, that triumph transformed into something darker. What began as victory quickly turned into one of the most infamous massacres of the Middle Ages. Chroniclers describe crusaders flooding into the city in waves, swords drawn, shields lifted, their eyes blazing with a strange mixture of exhaustion, joy, and religious frenzy. To many of them, this was not just a battle. It was a holy cleansing. Preachers had told them for years that Jerusalem must be purified of unbelievers. And now, with the city under their control, they believed it was time to carry out God's will. What followed would leave an enduring scar on history. The first targets were those closest to the walls. Defenders who had survived the siege were cut down as they tried to retreat deeper into the city. Panic spread among the population. Families ran through the twisting alleys, searching for shelter. Some fled to their homes and bolted their doors. Others rushed to the sacred sites, hoping that holy places would protect them. But the Crusaders, burning with zeal, pushed deeper and deeper into the heart of the city. Jewish families gathered in their synagogues, clutching scrolls of the Torah, lighting candles, and praying for deliverance. Muslim residents sought refuge in mosques, calling on Allah to shield them. But the Crusaders saw no sanctuary, only enemies. Chroniclers from the Crusader side, such as Raymond of Aguilers, wrote with chilling pride about how the streets ran with the blood of the unfaithful. Muslim historians, by contrast, describe the event as a nightmare beyond words, a storm of destruction that consumed both the guilty and the innocent. The religious intensity of the moment cannot be overstated. To the Crusaders, the slaughter was not simply violence. It was liturgy, a dark form of worship. As they fought and killed, many stopped to pray, to sing hymns, or to raise their swords toward heaven in thanksgiving. They believed themselves to be instruments of God's justice. Chroniclers even record crusaders marching barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre while battle still raged outside, their weapons dripping, their mouths chanting psalms. The contrast was surreal. The holiest prayers spoken in the midst of devastation. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the horror was total. Witnesses wrote of people running through smoke-filled streets, clutching children, searching for places to hide. Some tried to bribe crusaders with coins and jewelry, hoping to be spared. Others fought back desperately with whatever weapons they could find. Kitchen knives, farming tools, even stones. But the imbalance of power was overwhelming. Trained knights in armor faced starving civilians with little hope of survival. The massacre spread from quarter to quarter. Markets once filled with traders and pilgrims became killing grounds. Courtyards were littered with abandoned belongings. Cooking pots, sandals, prayer beads, manuscripts, left behind in desperate flight. Fires broke out as torches were thrown into homes, the smoke rising above the city like a black crown. The soundscape was unforgettable. Screams, prayers, shouts of victory, and the constant clang of weapons. And yet, for the Crusaders, this was not chaos but destiny. Chroniclers described them kneeling in the streets after bouts of killing, singing hymns of praise, thanking God for granting them triumph. To modern ears, this seems monstrous, but in the mindset of the 11th century, they believed they were cleansing the earthly Jerusalem to make way for the heavenly one. In their eyes, what they did was not cruelty but devotion. The numbers vary, but most accounts agree that tens of thousands perished in the first 2 days after the walls were breached. Entire communities vanished, Muslim, Jewish, and even some Eastern Christians caught in the violence. The Crusaders themselves made little distinction. To them, anyone who was not a Latin Christian was an obstacle to be removed. When news of the massacre spread across the Islamic world, it was remembered as a catastrophe, a crime that burned into collective memory. For centuries afterward, poets and historians recalled the sack of Jerusalem as one of the darkest moments in history. Even Christian chroniclers, though they often celebrated the event as a divine miracle, could not hide the scale of the devastation. What makes the massacre of Jerusalem so chilling is not only the death toll, but the mindset that fueled it. The men who carried out the violence did not see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as saints, fulfilling vows, marching under God's banner. Their actions were framed not as cruelty but as holiness. That is why, when the killing slowed and the fires died down, many of them went straight to the holiest church in Christendom, to kneel, to pray, and to thank God for what they had done. By the time silence returned to the streets, Jerusalem had been transformed. It was no longer the vibrant, multi-faith city it had been just days before. It had become a conquered symbol, a city baptized not with water, but with blood and fire. And for the Crusaders, this was not the end, but only the beginning of their new kingdom. When the storm of steel and fire finally began to fade, Jerusalem lay in silence. The noise of clashing swords and desperate screams gave way to something even more unsettling: the emptiness of a city stripped of life. Smoke drifted through the narrow streets, rising from burnt houses and shattered markets. The stench of ash and fear filled the air. What had once been a thriving, sacred metropolis was now a ghostly shell of itself. For the Crusaders, however, the aftermath was not defeat but triumph. Chroniclers describe how, while parts of the city still smoldered, groups of Crusader knights removed their helmets and marched barefoot through the streets. They sang hymns, some in Latin, some in their native tongues, voices echoing against the stone walls that only hours earlier had echoed with cries of despair. Many of them wept openly, not from sorrow but from joy, convinced that they had witnessed a miracle. They had not only captured Jerusalem, they believed they had purified it. The first place many of them went was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This sacred site, believed to be the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, had been their ultimate goal from the moment they set out on the long journey from Europe. Chroniclers describe knights and priests walking through the ruined city barefoot, chanting psalms as they went. When they reached the church, they knelt at the tomb, laying down their swords and prayed. For them, the violence outside was already history. Inside this holy place, they felt they were closer to heaven than ever before. But for the inhabitants who had survived, the scene was one of unending grief. Muslim and Jewish families who managed to escape the slaughter emerged cautiously from hiding places. Basements, wells, corners of ruined homes, only to find their city transformed beyond recognition. Shops that once bustled with trade were reduced to charred wood. Synagogues and mosques stood empty, some desecrated, others burned. The survivors spoke in whispers, as if their voices might still draw the attention of the conquerors. Chroniclers from the Islamic world later wrote of this moment with haunting detail. They spoke of families broken apart, children lost, and entire neighborhoods erased. To them, the aftermath of the Crusader conquest was not a miracle but a catastrophe, a day when the city of peace became the city of horror. Yet the Crusaders saw things differently. In their eyes, the silence of Jerusalem was proof of divine judgment. They believed the city had been cleansed, made ready for a new beginning. Knights and nobles divided the quarters among themselves. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was restored to Latin control. Even the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in Islam, was rededicated as a Christian church. The transformation was total, a spiritual conquest as much as a military one. The streets themselves told the story. Abandoned belongings lay everywhere, A child's wooden toy, a merchant's balance scale, fragments of manuscripts, broken pottery. These silent witnesses spoke of a city emptied in an instant. Crusader chroniclers did not dwell on these details. They preferred to emphasize the miracle of victory, the fulfillment of prophecy. But for modern readers, those fragments remind us of the human cost hidden behind the triumphant words. And yet, in the middle of this devastation, a strange duality existed. While some crusaders knelt in prayer, others looted. Gold, silver, silks, and relics were taken from homes and holy places. The hunger that had driven them through deserts and mountains now turned into greed. Treasure was carried into the crusader camp, shared among leaders and soldiers alike. This too was framed as part of divine justice, spoils given by God to his chosen warriors. The atmosphere in Jerusalem after the fall was therefore one of contradictions. For the Crusaders, it was heaven on earth, a reward for years of hardship. For the inhabitants who remained, it was hell made real, their sacred city transformed into a fortress of their conquerors. This tension would define the new kingdom of Jerusalem that emerged from the ashes, a kingdom built on triumph for some and tragedy for others. What makes the aftermath so striking is not just the physical destruction but the symbolism. Jerusalem had been a city of many faiths, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims had lived side by side, not always peacefully, but together. In the summer of 1099, that fragile balance was shattered. The city became a trophy, a banner raised to prove the righteousness of one side at the expense of all others. As the sun set over the ruined skyline, the Crusaders filled the churches with prayers of thanksgiving. Outside, smoke still curled from smoldering homes. Inside, men sang of victory and salvation. It was a chilling contrast. A city both holy and haunted, a place where heaven and hell seemed to exist side by side. And in that silence, history itself seemed to pause. The Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, but what they had unleashed would echo across centuries, fueling anger, devotion, and memory that would never fade. The fall of Jerusalem in July 1099 was not only a military event. It became a story told and retold, reshaped by chroniclers, preachers, and historians. And depending on who told it, the capture of the Holy City was either the greatest miracle of the age or one of its darkest nightmares. On the Crusader side, chroniclers celebrated the conquest as divine proof of God's favor. Raymond of Aguilers, a chaplain who marched with the army, wrote with awe about how the Crusaders entered the city with cries of joy, singing hymns to the Lord. He described the victory as not just a battle won, but a holy cleansing, Jerusalem purified by the hand of God. To him, and to many who followed the cross, the massacre was not shameful but sacred. He believed that every drop of blood spilled was part of God's mysterious plan. Other Latin writers echoed this vision. Guibert of Nogent declared the conquest a miracle, comparing it to biblical battles where God struck down the enemies of Israel. Chroniclers even claimed that angels were seen on the battlefield, guiding the Crusaders' swords. These accounts were read aloud in churches back in Europe, filling peasants and nobles alike with awe. For those who had not joined the First Crusade, the story of Jerusalem's fall became both inspiration and warning. This was what happened when God's warriors fought with faith. But across the Islamic world, the story sounded very different. Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and later historians described the conquest as a catastrophe. They wrote of mosques desecrated, families slaughtered, and the city reduced to silence. For them, it was not a miracle but a massacre. The memory of 1099 burned into Muslim consciousness, fueling calls for revenge. In later centuries, leaders like Saladin would cite the atrocities of the Crusaders as justification for their own campaigns to retake the Holy City. Jewish accounts, too, speak of tragedy. The Jewish community of Jerusalem had lived there for centuries, despite countless wars. In 1099, many of them took refuge in their synagogues, clutching the Torah, lighting candles, and praying for deliverance. But Crusader sources admit that entire congregations perished when the synagogues were set aflame. For Jewish writers, this became another chapter in the long story of persecution, one that echoed the destructions of earlier centuries. The question of numbers has always been debated. Crusader chroniclers wrote with pride that tens of thousands were slain. Muslim sources often agreed, portraying the streets as flooded with death. Modern historians, however, are cautious. They suggest the population of Jerusalem at the time was likely between 30,000 and 40,000. How many perished is uncertain, perhaps thousands, perhaps more. What is certain is that the violence was immense, and that its memory was carefully shaped to serve different purposes. What makes these interpretations fascinating is how they reveal the psychology of the age. For the Crusaders, violence was not seen as cruelty but as obedience to God. Killing infidels was preached as a holy act, a way to cleanse the sacred city. In their eyes, this was justice, not atrocity. For Muslims and Jews, of course, the same event was unspeakable horror, proof of the brutality of foreign invaders. And so, two completely different stories were born out of the same streets, the same days, the same fire. Later medieval writers turned the conquest of Jerusalem into legend. Poets sang of nights bathed in heavenly light. Priests compared it to the fall of Jericho, when God's chosen people destroyed the walls with trumpets. Pilgrims flocked to the city, eager to walk the streets, purified by blood. At the same time, Muslim poets mourned Jerusalem as a city torn from their hands, a jewel stolen by violence, waiting to be redeemed. Even today, the events of 1099 remain a point of contention. Was this the first holy war massacre in history? Was it the product of medieval fanaticism, or of the brutal logic of siege warfare? Historians still debate, but what no one denies is that the fall of Jerusalem changed the Middle East forever. It ignited centuries of war, mistrust, and cultural memory that still echoes today. The Chronicles remind us of something essential about history. Events are not only what happened, but how they are remembered. For some, Jerusalem 1099 was the high point of faith. For others, it was proof of humanity's darkest instincts. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the tension between devotion and destruction, salvation and suffering. By the time the dust settled, Jerusalem was not just a city. It was a story, one told in churches, mosques, and synagogues for generations. A story of victory for some, and tragedy for others. A story that even now, nearly 1,000 years later, forces us to ask, how far will people go when they believe that God is on their side? When the dust finally settled and the chance of victory faded into silence, the memory of July 1099 did not remain within the walls of Jerusalem. It spread across continents, carried in chronicles, sermons, and stories. The capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders became more than a single event. It became a symbol, one that shaped centuries of conflict, devotion, and myth. For the Crusaders themselves, the legacy was immediate triumph. They had endured unimaginable hardship, deserts without water, battles in foreign lands, and starvation outside Jerusalem's walls. And now, against all odds, they stood victorious in the holiest city of Christendom. This was, to them, undeniable proof that God had blessed their mission. Preachers across Europe proclaimed the conquest as a miracle, a victory that confirmed the righteousness of the First Crusade. Pilgrims soon flocked eastward, eager to touch the stones and streets, purified by blood and prayer. The new rulers wasted no time in establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian state carved directly from the heart of the Muslim world. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the Crusade's leaders, refused the title of king, declaring himself instead the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Others, however, would not be so modest. Within years, Jerusalem became a Christian capital, its sacred places rededicated, its walls fortified, its memory reshaped to reflect the triumph of Latin Christendom. But outside Crusader circles, the legacy was very different. In the Islamic world, the sack of Jerusalem was remembered as a wound, an open scar on the heart of Islam. Poets wrote of the tragedy, historians recorded it with outrage, and preachers invoked it as a call for jihad. To them, the conquest was not a miracle but an atrocity, a crime against the faithful, a city stolen by force and desecrated by foreigners. The stories of 1099 fueled anger and resistance, and in time, they gave rise to figures like Saladin, who would fight to reclaim the Holy City less than a century later. For Jewish communities, too, the memory was one of devastation. Generations later, Jewish chroniclers recalled the burning of synagogues and the slaughter of congregations who had sought sanctuary in prayer. To them, it was yet another chapter in a long history of persecution, one that stood alongside expulsions, pogroms, and massacres. The name Jerusalem carried not only the weight of holiness but also of sorrow. What makes the legacy of 1099 so powerful is how differently it was remembered. To Christians in Europe, it was the greatest victory of the age. To Muslims, it was the darkest of tragedies. To Jews, it was a moment of mourning. Each community told its story, passing it down through generations, shaping the way people thought about faith, violence, and destiny. Even today, historians point to the fall of Jerusalem as a turning point. It revealed the terrifying power of religious fervor, showing how faith could inspire not only incredible endurance, but also unspeakable cruelty. It demonstrated the fragility of cities caught between worlds, where culture and faith collided in ways both creative and destructive. And it marked the beginning of nearly 2 centuries of crusader states, wars, and shifting alliances that would reshape the map of the Middle East. Yet, perhaps the deepest legacy is not political but human. The chronicles remind us of the voices lost, merchants who never reopened their stalls, children whose laughter vanished from the courtyards, families who prayed for deliverance and found none. They remind us that behind every crusader hymn, there was a scream. Behind every triumphal banner, a home reduced to ashes. Behind every prayer of thanksgiving, a memory of fear. For the Crusaders, July 1099 was the end of a journey. For the world, it was the beginning of centuries of memory. And those memories, shaped in fire and faith, continue to echo across history. The legacy of the First Crusade is not just the story of knights and kings, or of cities conquered and kingdoms built. It is the story of how belief can drive humanity to both its greatest heights and its lowest depths. Jerusalem became the prize, the battlefield, the dream, and the nightmare. And so, when we look back at that summer of 1099, we see more than just a city taken. We see the birth of myths, the clash of civilizations, and the enduring reminder that when people believe God is on their side, there is no limit to what they will do, for glory, for faith, or for power.